the magnitude of warming we can expect in the worst case scenario, which combines both the kind of anthropogenic emissions we can expect, the actual concentrations attributable to human emissions, the climate sensitivity, so what we expect the Earth system to react and what that leads to in terms of end concentrations, but also secondly, the rate of change. Because obviously there's a huge difference between getting 2 degrees in the space of, say, 100 years versus 2 degrees in the space of a couple of decades. Thirdly is, as Goody mentioned as well, how societies react, both through potentially things like geoengineering, but also in the short term, things like political change, conflict, etc. And I think the fourth one I tend to have, which is slightly different, is how does the overall Earth system respond? Because often we have this tendency to think about climate change and its risk assessment as just climate change, when in reality we know it interacts with a whole kind of load and system of other planetary boundaries, and how things like ocean acidification, biodiversity loss, and collapse play out will obviously have huge ramifications for human societies as well. I'll now get into it. So we've already actually covered some of this. I think both Tim and Goody have mentioned some of the results we'll be talking about here, but there's good reasons to expect that we are going to potentially go above 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, and it could potentially be far, far higher. So one study a few years ago put forward the kind of likely range of 2 to 4.9 degrees by 2100. The coupled model into comparison project, CMIP6, which underpins the most recent assessment report, produced higher results than we usually have from models. This could be for a number of reasons, including kind of more refined treatment of cloud dynamics. A number of the higher results were eventually excluded because they weren't fitting to observational results. But nonetheless, we did end up with a kind of a pretty high level of climate sensitivity in AR6. So the 6th assessment report ends up both constraining the climate sensitivity, so the amount of warming we can expect if we double CO2 in the atmosphere. So it got constrained to roughly 2 to 5 degrees Celsius. That's the very likely range. The interesting thing was that essentially 1.5 degrees or anything below that was ruled out, but anything above 5 degrees and plus could not be ruled out. As Goody's already mentioned, there have been some new mechanisms that have been discovered in recent years, such as the potential for a stratocumulus cloud breakup with temperatures of roughly 6 to 8 degrees being added on top of the warming we already have. And overall, we do know that the risk of climate change is roughly fat-tailed. So work by, I think it was Wagner and Weizmann a number of years ago, did some basic calculations and came up with the idea that if you have 700 parts per million, which is a kind of middle of the road estimate for concentrations, you have a roughly 10% chance of exceeding 6 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. What do we know so far? The answer is somewhat very little. So this is based upon a piece of research I did with a number of colleagues led by Florian Oregien at the University of Gießen, where essentially did text mining of IPCC reports to look at the mention of different degrees. And of course, this is a kind of imperfect proxy for whether they're kind of covering those degrees. But we also combined that with some literature sampling to verify results. And what we found was that we were essentially betting on the best case, that the vast majority of research that the IPCC covers, and the IPCC is supposed to be indicative of the state of research, is focused upon 1.5 to 2 degrees. When you look at, say, for example, a scenario of 700 parts per million, which again is this kind of middle of the road scenario, you end up with 2/3 the probability mass, the likelihood, being above 3 degrees Celsius. But just around 10% of the mentions of temperature rise in the IPCC reports is for 3 degrees or above. The IPCC itself, in AR5, it notes that there have been very few estimates of the aggregate impacts at 3 degrees or above. So overall, the topic seems to be neglected and understudied. And that's just looking at the question of the kind of biophysical side of things, so the rate of change and the amount of warming we can expect. Why should we worry about this? I think both Goody and Tim have already given you ample reasons for that. I'm just going to add a few more on top of it. So first of all, I think as Goody mentioned, climate change has been implicated in mass extinction events in history. There's been 5 big ones about the Phanerozoic history of planet Earth. And the most recent evidence suggests that warming has been implicated in every single one of them. The worst of which was the Great Permian Dying, which was roughly 252 million years ago. And estimates vary, but it could have wiped out roughly 80 to 90% of the biosphere at the time. There was some work by a geologist by the name of Daniel Rothman, and he's done a lot of work trying to calculate what's the carbon threshold for a mass extinction event. How much carbon do you need to have, and what's the rate of change necessary before you lock in place processes and feedbacks that are likely to lead to a mass extinction event. And this graph off to the side, figure 4, shows the Acquis work published back in, I think, 2017 or 2018. And as you can see, the kind of central red line here is his best estimate for the threshold effect for a mass extinction event. And the lines above and below, the dotted lines, are the kind of 50% certainty intervals. And basically, pretty much every single one of the RCPs represent concentration pathways, end up crossing that line and end up creating a potential for a mass extinction event. There's also just simply the fact that historically humans, whether we like it or not, have been very influenced by our climate, if not actually adapted towards a very particular climatic niche. So Tim mentioned the work of Zucchi and others, which looked at the idea of a human climate niche, that when you look at things historically, roughly 80% of the population has been adapted to a kind of narrow climatic envelope of roughly 13 degrees mean annual average temperature. And when we stray from that even a little bit, it often has very large consequences. So there's a very large body of literature looking at how the rise and fall of empires and different polities and their transformation throughout history has often been tied to climate change. And this has notably been usually due to very, very small regional changes. So we're talking 1 to 2 degrees variation at a regional level. So this is based upon a lot of different work, including people like Harvey Weiss, who looks at mega droughts, as well as people like Eric Klein, who's looked at how the Bronze Age collapse, in which a large number of interconnected societies in the Mediterranean collapsed at the same time that we experienced cooling and drying in that region. What are the pathways that we can expect for climate change to have in order to reach a catastrophe? One is just the sum total of impacts. The compound hazards we expect from climate change eventually overwhelm adaptive capacity. The much more likely, much more interesting one is systemic risk, that we have what are called risk cascades, where a single hazard or risk has knock-on effects which amplify or trigger other risks. And we see this with COVID-19, for instance. And this is something that's already happened when it comes to climate change. In 2010, there was a heat wave in Russia, which actually reduced cereal crop yields, leading to Russia to do an export ban on their cereals. And in turn, that actually led to a price shock on the global food market, which led in turn to a surge of food bank usage in the UK, as well as actually contributed to the political turmoil that was seen in Egypt that year. There's also potential for it to trigger other extreme risks, such as nuclear warfare, or as Goody suggested, potentially a geoengineering experiment gone wrong. And I think a really interesting one we don't think about enough is latent risk. That if we have warming which we can somehow adapt to or handle, given kind of high levels of GDP and technology, but what happens if we have some kind of a collapse event? Say, for instance, the wake of a nuclear war, and suddenly 6 degrees of warming comes rushing back in after a nuclear winter. That's what I call latent risk, essentially. An underlying risk built into the system would potentially re-emerges eventually. And this could be triggered by anything, whether it's nuclear war or even a zombie apocalypse. Cue for laughter, and we'll move on. So what do we need to know? I think I already partially covered this in the 4 questions, but if you're really trying to put it down to really kind of streamlined agenda of sorts, I'd say extremes, both in terms of magnitude and rate of warming, the long-term impacts, so thinking beyond 2100 and really thinking about these really big potential mechanisms that you see at play in mass extinction events. So things like ocean anoxia. Third is a more complex risk assessment, looking at risk cascades as well as risk responses, which is something the IPCC is slowly moving towards. The most recent assessment report was the first time the IPCC actually started talking about risk responses, which is a good sign. And then moving on to kind of early warning signals, which is really about making things more useful in terms of responding to climate change. I should note that when it comes to both early warning signals and complex risk assessment, we really need to think about under what scenarios the climate change occurring. Because there's a huge difference between climate change occurring in a world full of kind of competition and relative equality versus one that's occurring under fragmentation and inequality. I've been doing quite a lot of work with a historian by the name of John Houghton. His kind of big pet theory is that climate change is only leading to collapse when it usually coincides with a polity that has high levels of inequality. That is something that seems to breed fragility and vulnerability. And he has a number of different case studies, including the Byzantine Empire, to kind of buttress this scenario. And then finally, we have to kind of find a way to model all this together. I think, as Goody mentioned, the kind of worst case is when you actually have the worst case across all those four, both the Earth system response, the human response, as well as both the magnitude and the rate of warming.